In the bitter winter of 1857, 4 women mysteriously disappeared from a secluded Mormon settlement in the Utah Territory, vanishing without leaving even a single track in the snow. Their husband, Ezekiel Whitmore, insisted they had set out to visit relatives back east, a claim that defied logic since the trails were impassable during what was recorded as one of the harshest winters in territorial history. For more than 60 years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kept the case locked away in confidential archives. Then, in 1920, workers digging the foundation for a new meeting house unearthed something so disturbing that church leaders could no longer keep silent. What lay beneath those stones would shake the community's understanding of faith, family, and the sacrifices demanded in the building of Zion. But before we dive deeper into Ezekiel Whitmore's story on the winter that forever changed the settlement, I'll warn you, this channel isn't for everyone. Only those willing to face the darker corners of history should continue. If you're ready to confront the mysteries America tried to erase, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and drop a comment telling me which state you're listening from. The truth about Utah's early Mormon colonies isn't easy to hear. Are you brave enough to uncover it? Let's find out together. Because what surfaced in 1920 proved one thing. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Back in 1847, the Utah Territory was a place of soaring hopes and brutal realities. When Brigham Young looked across the barren Salt Lake Valley and declared, "This is the place," he was claiming a harsh land of salt flats and mountains that cut settlers off for months at a time. Put to the Mormon pioneers, though this wilderness was the promised refuge, a sanctuary after years of persecution that had driven them from Missouri, Illinois, and beyond. Ezekiel Whitmore came with the second wave of settlers in late September 1847. Unlike Brigham Young's advance party, his company reached the valley unprepared for winter, short on supplies and shelter. Whitmore was 34, a carpenter from Vermont who had joined the faith in 1843 after hearing Joseph Smith preach in Nauvoo. What made him unusual was not just his trade, but his family arrangement. He brought with him 4 wives, married under the secret doctrine of plural marriage, which church leaders believed would ensure eternal blessings. His first wife, Sarah, 31, had been married to him for 8 years. Unable to have children, she accepted plural marriage as a path to celestial glory, and even encouraged Ezekiel to take a second wife. That was Rebecca Thornton, 27, an educated woman fluent in English and German. She questioned doctrine more openly than most, but Ezekiel seemed to respect her mind. The third wife, Mary Kellerman, just 24, had joined in early 1847, pregnant with her first child. She struggled during the trek west after losing her immigrant parents in the Nauvoo years. The youngest, Ruth Caldwell, only 19, was given to Ezekiel by church leaders after her family perished in Missouri. The marriage seen as a safeguard for the orphaned girl. The Whitmore family built their homestead in Mill Creek, about 8 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Ezekiel chose the spot for its year-round stream and fertile ground, but mostly for its solitude. He was a reserved man who preferred his wife's company to community gatherings. That first autumn, he labored furiously to prepare for the harsh winter, erecting a strong cabin with separate quarters for each wife. Carefully following the guidelines Mormon men used to keep harmony in plural households, by December the Whitmores seemed well provided for. Sarah oversaw domestic stores with quiet skill. Rebecca kept meticulous records and studied medicine. Mary preserved food despite her pregnancy, and Ruth threw herself into heavy work with youthful energy. Visitors described the household as unusually united, a shining example of order and prosperity. Bishop William Curtis, who stopped by in early December, even praised their harmony in his official report. Yet, in his private diary, he confessed that something about the visit unsettled him, though he never dared record exactly what. The four women seemed bound together in a way that unsettled anyone who observed them for long. They spoke as though sharing a single thought, often finishing one another's sentences, and their movements mirrored each other with uncanny precision, bore the same curious markings on their wrists. Deliberate cuts they dismissed as kitchen mishaps, though their identical depth and age suggested otherwise. The winter of 1847 into 1848 was one of the harshest Utah had ever known. Snow began falling in mid-November and lingered until March, while the temperature plunged to 20 below more than once. Winds tore across the valley with enough force to topple a grown man. Families in the main settlement endured with difficulty, but those in the outlying cabins, like the Whitmores, faced a true trial of endurance, faith, and preparation. The last reliable account of all for Whitmore women together came on December 19, 1847. A hunting party from the settlement passed their cabin. Noticing smoke curling from the chimney, when they stopped to offer fresh venison, Sarah and Rebecca answered the door. They accepted the gift graciously, but politely declined an invitation to join Christmas worship in town, explaining they intended to hold their own service at home. What followed would trouble investigators for generations and give rise to one of the darkest mysteries in early Mormon history. The first sign of something amiss came on January 8, 1848, when Ezekiel Whitmore arrived at the settlement requesting a private word with Bishop Curtis. Witnesses described him as aged beyond his years in just a matter of weeks. His clothing hung untidy, his beard untrimmed, and his eyes carried what one observer called the haunted look of a man who had seen too much. Behind closed doors, Ezekiel explained that his wife, Sarah, had received a divine revelation instructing her to journey east to tend a gravely ill sister in Missouri. He claimed she felt the command so urgently that she set out immediately, joining a band of travelers who had passed through. The bishop's doubts were immediate. No one would attempt such a journey in the dead of winter, and Sarah had never spoken of a sister in Missouri. Pressed for details, Ezekiel's account shifted first. The travelers were missionaries, then mountain men who supposedly knew hidden winter trails. Throughout, his hands trembled, and his gaze darted repeatedly toward the cabin door. Most troubling was his insistence that the bishop must not visit the Whitmore home, insisting his remaining wives were undergoing a period of spiritual purification that demanded complete seclusion, though Bishop Curtis dutifully recorded the conversation in official records. His private diary betrayed his suspicions. Brother Whitmore speaks of revelations, yet I sense concealment. His words ring not with sorrow but with guilt, and his explanations defy reason as well as the seasons. 3 weeks later, on January 30th, Ezekiel returned with yet another alarming tale. Now he insisted that Rebecca, too, had received a calling, time to serve as a teacher in a mission school. She, like Sarah, had departed eastward with supposed travelers, carrying only the barest provisions. The bishop's patience frayed. What company of travelers could possibly be moving through Utah in February? Ezekiel's response unraveled into ramblings about God's mysterious plans and trials of faith. Curtis demanded to see the remaining wives, but Ezekiel grew agitated, claiming Mary and Ruth lay bedridden with a fever too contagious for visitors. He swore to bring them into town once they recovered. By now, Curtis's unease had grown too grave to ignore. On February 3rd, he assembled 5 men to accompany him to the Whitmore homestead. The trek through waist-deep drifts and icy slopes consumed an entire day. When they arrived, Ezekiel was alone. He greeted them politely but nervously, seated beside a fire too small to warm such a large cabin. His story had shifted yet again. Mary and Ruth, he now claimed, had miraculously recovered and chosen to follow their sisters east, departing only 2 days prior with a band of trappers who promised them safe passage. The bishop asked to see the women's belongings. Ezekiel led them through rooms that had been hurriedly cleared. Clothes, books, and trinkets were missing, but the heavy furnishings and kitchen tools remained, strangely untouched for women supposedly embarking on a permanent journey. Behind the cabin, the visitors noted earth freshly disturbed, despite the ground being frozen solid. Ezekiel explained it away as work expanding his root cellar for next winter. But the amount of digging seemed far too great for such a task. When one man remarked on the impossibility of breaking frozen ground, Ezekiel's retort was sharp. God's work demands labor even in the hardest conditions. The men stayed the night, yet none rested easily. The cabin felt wrong to still, too empty of the small domestic sounds that signaled a woman's hand in the home. No murmured voices, no rustling of skirts, no warmth of fresh bread or butter. Their meal consisted entirely of preserved rations, a strange omission when fresh food should have been available. Then came the most chilling moment. Thomas Garrett awoke in the night to the sound of faint sobbing, as if from beneath the floorboards, though the others dismissed it as wind or shifting timbers. Garrett swore he had heard human voices weeping in despair. When they departed the next morning, the party carried with them more questions than answers. In his private diary, Bishop Curtis recorded his grim suspicion. "I fear Brother Whitmore's deeds may bring upon us not heavenly trials, but earthly shame most grievous. The harsh silence of winter has often been known to drive men to desperate ends, and some feared that the weight of plural marriage had crushed Ezekiel Whitmore's spirit. Bishop Curtis, however, found himself caught in a dilemma. At the time, the Mormon settlements were already drawing the wary eye of federal authorities, and any hint of scandal could bring the government's hand down on the fragile community. The principle of plural marriage was controversial enough. Whispers of violence or madness tied to it would be disastrous. After conferring with fellow leaders, the bishop resolved to keep watch over Ezekiel quietly, hoping that with the coming of spring, answers might emerge. Through those long, bitter months, Ezekiel still appeared in the settlement, always alone, hand visibly wasting away. He insisted that his wives had safely journeyed east, even claiming to receive cheerful letters from them. Yet he never produced a single one, sometimes saying they were too private, other times that they had been lost, put in a fire. As doubts spread, neighbors began whispering. Some thought he might have sent the women away out of poverty or household strife. Others suspected something darker, pointing to his restless behavior and the gaps in his tales. The truth would not surface until April of 1848, when the thaw came and Bishop Curtis finally inspected the Whitmore homestead. What he found there would haunt him to his grave. The cabin appeared deserted for weeks, dust lying thick upon the furniture. The wives' rooms looked unnaturally clean, as though scrubbed in haste rather than prepared for travel. Beneath a loose floorboard, Curtis discovered Rebecca's cherished journal. Its last entry, dated December 20th, 1847, was penned in a trembling hand. "E says we must give the ultimate sacrifice for the eternal family. Yet I fear his revelations are born of something far darker than heaven." Behind the cabin lay the most disturbing evidence. The soil Ezekiel claimed to be digging for a root cellar stretched far beyond what storage would require. Disturbed in uneven stages, scattered among the earth were scraps of fabric, a wedding ring Sarah had worn since her marriage, and other personal effects. Nearby, in a clearing, Bishop Curtis found fire pits laid out in an intentional pattern. Mixed with the ashes were burned fragments of scripture, though not from standard Mormon texts. The legible scraps spoke of blood, atonement, and consecration through sacrifice, twisted interpretations that horrified him. Inside the cabin, hidden in a secret compartment, were Ezekiel's notebooks. His writings grew more unhinged with each page, describing an obsession with what he called the law of ultimate consecration. He had come to believe God demanded not just property, but life itself, in order to reach the highest glory. In his fevered visions, his wives had been chosen to fulfill this destiny. Later entries descended into wild scroll. Fixated on the willing offering of innocence and the sealing power of spilled blood. By then Ezekiel was gone. No trace of him remained. He had vanished into the vast wilderness, where a man could disappear forever. The church leaders, realizing the explosive nature of the discovery, acted swiftly. They sealed the records, swore the witnesses to silence, and dismantled the Whitmore cabin. The land was quietly purchased by the church and deemed unfit for settlement, its ground carefully restored. Officially, the 4 wives were recorded as having returned east. Unofficially, their fate became one of the darkest secrets in Utah's early history. Yet secrets have a way of surfacing. As the years passed, the tale survived in whispers. The winter when 4 women vanished, and one man's devotion twisted into something unspeakable. Some accounts claimed that Ezekiel's mind had been broken by solitude and religious fervor. Others whispered that he had uncovered something in that desolate valley, something that demanded a terrible offering in exchange for his family's survival. The most unsettling rumor of all was that Ezekiel had not acted alone. According to this version, his wives had been willing partners in a ritual they believed necessary for salvation, persuaded by their husbands' visions of divine command. If true, the calamity was not the product of one man's madness, but a shared conviction that had led them all into darkness. As the years went by, the land where the Whitmore home once stood gained a reputation of its own. Travelers crossing the valley spoke of unseen eyes watching them and of women's voices drifting on the cold wind, especially in winter. Church leaders dismissed these stories as folklore, yet the whispers added to the sense that something unresolved lingered there. The past might have remained buried if not for the steady growth of the church. By 1920, with new congregations forming in the Mill Creek area, church authorities chose a central plot of land for a new meeting house, unaware that it rested on ground tied to one of their darkest secrets. Work on the building began in October of that year under the supervision of Brother Samuel Morrison. Born in the valley, Morrison had grown up hearing old tales of the Whitmore family, but regarded them as little more than children's stories. For the first 2 days of digging, the crew uncovered only scraps of the past horseshoes, rusted tools, and fragments of farm life. On the 3rd day, everything changed. 4 feet beneath the soil, the workers uncovered a carefully built stone chamber, sealed with a heavy slab. Inside lay a collection of objects deliberately arranged, almost like a hidden shrine. There were 4 sets of women's clothing, each folded into its own pile with shoes, jewelry, and small purses containing papers that identified the owners: Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Whitmore, preserved by the dry air and stone walls. The belongings looked as though they had been placed there only days before, shaken. Morrison contacted Bishop Harold Stevenson, the ward leader. Stevenson, too young to know the full tale, quickly summoned higher authorities. Elder James Tanner, a senior church leader with access to the confidential archives, arrived within hours. His examination confirmed what many in the older generation had feared. The documents were genuine. Among the artifacts were farewell letters written by each wife, their words intended for family they would never see again. Sarah's message spoke of gratitude at being chosen by God to take part in an eternal sealing ordinance. Rebecca's letter was filled with doctrinal references, claiming that innocent blood shed in righteousness opened the gates of celestial glory. Mary's words were the most heartbreaking, speaking tenderly of the child she carried and her hope that offering to lives would double the blessing in heaven. Ruth's note, the briefest, overflowed with love and anticipation for the eternal family she believed awaited her. These letters revealed a truth far more disturbing than murder. The women had gone willingly, convinced of the sacredness of their deaths. Ezekiel had persuaded them that sacrifice was the price of eternal reward. Elder Tanner immediately halted the construction and ordered the sealed records concerning the Whitmore case to be brought from Salt Lake City. What emerged from those files deepened the mystery. Bishop Curtis's original investigation notes, never shared with others, hinted that this tragedy was not unique. Ezekiel's journals contained references to other men who claimed to have received similar revelations. Most alarming of all was a letter intercepted in 1849, addressed to Ezekiel at a remote Nevada mining camp, proof that whatever had begun in that frozen valley might not have ended there. The mysterious letter, signed only with the initials J.M., contained cryptic remarks about the completion of the work, expressing satisfaction that the ceiling had been finished according to the pattern revealed to us. It also mentioned that others, entrusted with the same sacred duty, had carried it out with equal loyalty and devotion. This hinted strongly that Ezekiel had not been a lone fanatic, but part of a concealed circle within the early Mormon community, men who had embraced radical interpretations of doctrine. According to their twisted beliefs, the highest act of consecration was the offering up of family members, whose sacrifice would ensure eternal glory in the celestial kingdom. When Elder Tanner's team began combing through early church records, they uncovered a troubling pattern scattered across pioneer settlements were unexplained vanishings and tragedies that had never been connected before. Between 1847 and 1855, at least a dozen families reported missing wives or children under suspiciously similar circumstances. In nearly every instance, the disappearances were explained away with claims that the victims had traveled east or been called to serve in distant missions. Strikingly, it was usually the male head of household who made these reports, asserting he had received divine revelation to release them for some spiritual purpose. Individually, the cases seemed unremarkable. Together, they suggested something chilling: a coordinated network carrying out what they believed to be sacred killings. The victims were overwhelmingly women and children. The perpetrators, on the other hand, were men renowned in their communities for zealous devotion and strong positions of influence. Even more disturbing was the discovery of letters exchanged between some of these men. The correspondence showed them reinforcing one another's convictions, providing scriptural justifications, and celebrating their holy duty. From their writings, it became clear that they had built an elaborate theology, weaving obscure passages of Mormon scripture together with personal revelation. They believed plural marriage was merely a first step, a prelude to an even higher law, the ultimate sacrifice of one's family as proof of perfect consecration to God. In their minds, They were trailblazers of a deeper faith, convinced that one day all saints would be required to embrace the same path to achieve celestial exaltation. As Tanner's investigation deepened, the conspiracy widened in scope. Evidence suggested the secret order included respected leaders scattered across Utah territory. They coordinated discreetly, shared their interpretations, and supported one another's actions. Eventually, church authorities discovered their peak existence in the mid-1850s. What followed was a silent purge. Suspected members quietly removed from influence, some forced to disappear into the wilderness. Official records mentioned nothing, as leaders feared scandal and the fury of anti-Mormon critics. Yet the hidden chamber uncovered at Mill Creek told a darker truth. The cult's activities had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The careful preservation of belongings indicated that these killings were not seen as crimes, but as solemn ordinances, memorialized for eternity. The haunting question lingered: had the group been fully extinguished, or had fragments of it survived, continuing their rites in remote corners of the West? What lay buried beneath Mill Creek hinted at something vast, something that reached far beyond Ezekiel Whitmore and his family. The excavation revealed layer upon layer of secrecy. Beneath the first stone chamber, archaeologists uncovered a second place, painstakingly hollowed out of bedrock, 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Its stone-lined walls were still perfectly dry, thanks to drainage channels. Covering those walls were carvings, an unsettling blend of Mormon temple motifs, Masonic imagery, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and symbols of ancient sacrifice. At the chamber's center stood a rough-hewn granite altar, its surface darkened with stains later proven to be human blood. Surrounding it were 4 smaller platforms, each inscribed with a woman's name: Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, alongside dates. From the brutal winter of 1847 to 1848, scriptural passages had been carefully etched around the names, twisting familiar verses into justifications for taking human life in the name of divine law. Carved above the central altar was an unsettling inscription: "No love is greater than to give one's life for another. Yet holier still is the love that offers up the lives of the cherished for the glory of God." Across the ceiling, symbols of eternal family bonds had been etched, but the true horror was uncovered beneath the stone platforms. Each slab concealed a carefully arranged burial site containing human remains, preserved through deliberate mummification techniques. The 4 women had been prepared with methods suggesting detailed knowledge of embalming, perhaps influenced by early Mormon fascination with Egyptian rites. Their preservation allowed investigators to determine the cause of death. Each had been slain by a single precise thrust to the heart from what appeared to be a ritual blade. The wounds were identical in depth and position, indicating practiced execution according to a strict ceremonial pattern. Even more disturbing, the women had been clothed in specially prepared white robes adorned with symbols of faith and personal tokens of spiritual significance. These garments had clearly been crafted with ritual purpose, implying that the killings were viewed not as murders, but as sacred ordinances requiring solemn preparation. The evidence forced Elder Tanner's team to consider that the Whitmore wives may not only have consented, but actively believed their deaths were divine sacrifices, guaranteeing salvation. The timing of the killings suggested they were not carried out all at once, but rather in a series, each forming part of a larger ritual cycle. Adding to the horror, stone tablets set into niches along the walls recorded the ceremonies in chilling detail. The women's last words, their prayers of gratitude, and their acceptance of their chosen role in the ritual. The inscriptions also referenced a great work guided by revelation from above, framing the sacrifices as part of a broader spiritual mission. The chamber's design revealed it was intended for repeated use. Drainage channels, preservation spaces, and storage areas for robes and ritual tools all pointed to a facility built for ongoing ceremonies. Evidence confirmed that others besides the Whitmore women had perished. Their records, carved into the stone, spoke of at least 8 additional victims from 1848 to 1855. Drawn from other families reported missing during Utah's early settlement period. The scale of the conspiracy grew clearer. For nearly a decade, a clandestine circle had conducted ritual sacrifices, constructing theological justifications and permanent facilities for their acts. More shocking still, their records revealed lists of potential candidates and plans to spread operations into other settlements. The documents strongly implied that members in positions of church leadership had been involved, exploiting their authority to select victims and suppress suspicions. Elder Tanner realized his team had not uncovered isolated tragedies, but evidence overt of an organized underground sect that had infiltrated the early church at its highest levels. The implications for the church's reputation and the faith of its members were devastating. Tanner immediately informed the First Presidency, knowing the decision ahead would determine whether this truth was exposed or buried to preserve the institution. Yet, the excavation revealed that the chamber still held darker secrets. A hidden passage concealed behind a false wall led to a deeper, more secretive chamber. This space, smaller yet more refined, had been constructed with masterful precision. Stone walls carved with intricate symbols, ceilings upheld by elegant archways. It was here, in this inner sanctum, that the full extent of the conspiracy and the prostensities of its leaders would finally come to light. This chamber was unmistakably the inner sanctuary of the hidden order, the place where their most sacred gatherings and ceremonies had unfolded. At its center stood a massive stone table, crafted with astonishing skill. Its surface bore intricate engravings, detailed maps of the Utah Territory, meticulously marking Mormon settlements and highlighting sites chosen for the group's secret activities. Alongside these maps were notes about the families in each settlement, with particular focus on households that could provide suitable candidates for their grim rituals. But the most unsettling discovery lay in a series of carved stone tablets These contained the complete theological system devised by the sect to rationalize their practices. The writings identified the leader as Jeremiah Blackwood, a man who claimed to have received direct revelations from Joseph Smith himself. He established what he called the Order of Eternal Sacrifice. According to the tablets, Blackwood had attended some of Smith's private meetings in Nauvoo and twisted the prophet's teachings on eternal families and celestial marriage into a terrifying doctrine. In his view, the truest test of faith required families to prove absolute devotion, even to the point of surrendering their very lives in order to secure exaltation in the afterlife. The tablets gave detailed instructions for selecting families. Ideal candidates were deeply faithful, lived in remote settlements, and lacked close ties that might draw outside attention if they vanished. Polygamous households were prime targets, as their complex dynamics and frequent travel made disappearances easier to explain away. It was during the winter of 1846–47, while the Mormon exodus westward was underway, that Blackwood recruited Ezekiel Whitmore. Ezekiel's unwavering religious zeal, introverted nature, and marriage to 4 women with no nearby kin made him an ideal subject. Recruitment was a gradual process. Blackwood first shared supposed higher laws of celestial marriage, then slowly introduced Ezekiel to darker revelations. By the time the Whitmore family arrived in Utah, he was fully indoctrinated and prepared to carry out the sacrifice of his wives during their first harsh winter in the territory. The tablets also revealed that the order had spread far beyond Mill Creek. Independent cells existed across Mormon settlements in the West, each led by a trusted member personally recruited by Blackwood. These leaders identified targets, maintained contact through coded correspondence, and carried out the rituals. The Mill Creek Chamber was just one of several permanent sites, constructed to preserve a record of the ceremonies that the order believed would one day be recognized as sacred ordinances. Descriptions of the rituals themselves were chillingly precise. Blackwood had modeled them on a mixture of ancient sacrificial practices and early Mormon temple rites. Each rite spanned several days, including preparation, instruction, and the final act, which participants believed sealed their family's eternal glory. The tablets recorded in harrowing detail the Whitmore family's last days. On December 20th, 1847, Sarah, the first wife, willingly participated in the initial ceremony, convinced it would secure eternal exaltation for her household. The others followed in turn, with the last, Ruth, meeting her fate on February 15th, 1848. Each woman spent her final days in prayer, writing letters, preparing sacred burial clothing, and encouraging the others. The writings showed they believed wholeheartedly in their divine calling, even expressing joy at their role in the eternal plan. Even more disturbing, the tablets revealed plans for expansion. Dozens of families had been identified as future recruits, and new ritual sites were mapped across the frontier. The order was convinced that one day their practices would be accepted as official doctrine. required for the highest degrees of glory. Yet the records also explained the sudden collapse of the movement in the panned mid-1850s. Church authorities began noticing patterns of disappearance and launched a covert investigation. Brigham Young himself directed the inquiry, recognizing the danger posed by the order to the survival of the fledgling Mormon community. The crackdown was swift. Members were excommunicated, sent into exile, or quietly reassigned to remote areas. Underwatch. Ritual sites were sealed or destroyed, and all documentation was locked away to prevent public scandal. As for Jeremiah Blackwood, he vanished during this purge. Rumors claimed he fled to California, where he continued gathering followers and spreading his extremist creed in secret. Rumors had long circulated that Blackwood had established hidden enclaves in distant mining towns and frontier settlements, though no official records ever confirmed these activities. Among the tablets discovered was his final declaration to his followers, penned not long before he vanished. In it, he foretold that their secret practices would someday be recognized as divinely ordained, and would serve as the ultimate test of devotion for true disciples. He charged his adherents to safeguard their writings, and to continue their work in silence until the appointed time when the higher laws could be revealed openly. Elder Tanner and his team realized the enormity of what they had unearthed. Evidence of a clandestine sect within early Mormonism that had orchestrated ritual murders claiming scores of victims. The potential consequences for the Church's legacy and for the faith of millions were staggering. The documents hinted that senior church figures may have been aware of Blackwood's radical doctrines, but had failed to suppress them before they escalated into a murderous conspiracy. Even more unsettling was the suggestion that other branches of the order might have survived the official suppression, continuing their rites in isolated regions where discovery was unlikely. The influence of this hidden order appeared far greater than anyone had previously imagined, with implications stretching far beyond Utah. As Elder Tanner drafted his final report, he knew he faced an impossible choice. To reveal the truth would mean exposing the bloodiest and most shameful chapter in the Church's history, risking devastation of the faithful. To conceal it would mean leaving the victims Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth Whitmore, and countless others consigned to silence, an oblivion. The decision, however, would not be his alone. It would rest with the Church's highest council. On November 15, 1920, in the First Presidency's private chambers, President Heber J. Grant, his counselors, and the senior apostles gathered for a special session. Elder Tanner presented his findings in a sobering 3-hour briefing that one participant later described as the most disturbing in church history. The evidence could not be dismissed. The underground sanctuaries, the mummified remains, the inscribed tablets all confirmed the reality of a conspiracy that had claimed innocent lives under the guise of divine sacrifice. The order of eternal sacrifice had truly existed, and its shadow stretched farther than anyone had guessed. President Grant responded with calm resolve. After conferring with his counselors and receiving unanimous consent from the 12, he decreed that the evidence, would be secured in the church's most restricted archives, available only to top leadership. The victims would be quietly honored in private memorials, attended solely by church authorities. But the wider public would never learn of what had been uncovered. The rationale was clear. Public exposure would fuel anti-Mormon critics, undermine the faith of devoted believers, and inflict new pain on families already scarred by tragedy. Furthermore, the tablets suggested that the order had been crushed in the 1850s, leaving no active threat to society. The Mill Creek site was discreetly abandoned, the chambers beneath it filled with concrete, and the relics transported to a locked vault in Salt Lake City, alongside other sensitive records deemed too volatile for public release. Elder Tanner was directed to prepare a full confidential report for future leaders, and he, along with the workers and officials involved, was bound to secrecy by formal agreements. Officially, the construction delay at Mill Creek was blamed on difficult geological conditions. A new meeting house was completed 6 months later, several miles from the original site, serving the community for decades with no one suspecting what had been hidden beneath the ground nearby. Yet the investigation had revealed a more chilling possibility, that the order's reach had not ended entirely. Several of the inscriptions made reference to Western brethren who had carried the teachings to distant mining camps in Nevada, California, and Colorado. These cryptic notes implied that fugitives from the crackdown had established cells far beyond the church's authority. President Grant, troubled by the thought, quietly authorized a discreet inquiry to determine whether remnants of the order might still linger in the Western Frontier. This investigation, led not by regular missionaries but by the Church's own security agents, uncovered evidence of at least 3 more ritual sites that had been active in the late 1850s and early 1860s. The most unsettling discovery came from a mining settlement near Virginia City, Nevada, where they unearthed the remnants of a ritual chamber that appeared to have been used as late as 1875. This suggested that some members of the order had managed to keep their practices alive for nearly 3 decades after the official crackdown, adapting their methods to the rough, transient world of mining camps, places where disappearances could go unnoticed and uninvestigated. The persistence of these secret cells demanded swift action, but it also presented church leaders with serious challenges. Investigating order activities outside of Mormon communities risked exposing the conspiracy and would inevitably require cooperation with federal authorities, who might seize the opportunity to justify renewed crackdowns on the church itself. The solution was a clandestine program, quietly funded and staffed by the church, that operated for nearly 20 years. Its mission, to track down surviving members of the Order of Eternal Sacrifice and dismantle their operations without ever alerting public authority. These agents moved in silence, gathering intelligence, persuading some order members to abandon their practices, and discreetly removing others from positions of influence. Their efforts succeeded in disrupting at least 6 surviving cells, but in doing so, They uncovered the full extent of the conspiracy. Evidence suggested that the order had operated in at least 15 locations across the western frontier and had been responsible for more than 200 deaths between 1847 and 1875. The last surviving cell was destroyed in 1895. When church operatives tracked down Jeremiah Blackwood himself, now in his 70s and living under an assumed identity in a remote Colorado mining camp, Blackwood had continued his extreme rituals, gathering a small band of followers who carried out a dozen more killings in the preceding decade. The seizure of his extensive records finally brought the order of eternal sacrifice to an end. But those records also painted a disturbing picture. They showed that the order was far more organized and influential than anyone had believed. With ties to other radical religious groups and traces of influence on early Mormon doctrine that extended far beyond Utah, the Church's secret war against the order was never acknowledged publicly. Most members of the faith never knew such a group had ever existed in their midst. The victims of the rituals were remembered only in private memorials. Their names entered into hidden archives that honored their sacrifice, while concealing the grim truth of their deaths. Elder Tanner, who had first uncovered the Mill Creek chambers, completed his service to the church with distinction. He lived to the age of 93, taking the secret to his grave. In his personal journals, sealed after his death in 1963, he made only a brief, cryptic reference to the most difficult investigation of my life and a prayer for the souls of those who had perished in the name of misguided faith. The stone chambers beneath Mill Creek remain sealed to this day, preserved as silent witnesses to one of the darkest episodes in American religious history: the truth about Ezekiel Whitmore, his 4 wives, and the hundreds of victims claimed by the order lies locked away in the most guarded vaults of the church, known only to a select few entrusted with this dangerous knowledge. From time to time, modern church leaders have debated whether to reveal the truth, but each generation has ultimately decided that exposing the story would do more harm than good. Officially, the victims are remembered only as pioneers who disappeared on the frontier, their real fate hidden behind more than a century of secrecy. Today, the Mill Creek site is covered with thriving suburbs, busy shopping centers, and modern chapels that serve thousands of faithful families. Few residents have any idea that beneath their streets once stood ritual chambers where dozens lost their lives in the pursuit of eternal glory. The mystery of the winter of 1847 to 1848, when 4 women seemed to vanish into the snow without a trace, remains one of the Church's most closely guarded secrets. Whether the full truth will ever come to light, to remain buried under the weight of time and institutional silence, is a question only the future can answer. The story of Ezekiel Whitmore and his wives is a grim reminder of how deeply faith can be twisted when zeal becomes obsession, and how the search for eternal salvation can be warped into justification for terrible deeds. What began as the mystery of 4 vanished women in a remote Utah cabin unraveled into a conspiracy that shook the foundations of early Mormon history. And in the end, the Church's decision to hide the truth has shaped its legacy in ways that still echo more than a century later. And here's the chilling thought. If this is just one story hidden in America's past, what other secrets might still be waiting in the shadows? If this account gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're not afraid to confront the darkest mysteries of history. Tell me in the comments, should the Church finally reveal the full truth about the order, or are some secrets better left buried?